The Nazis also they didn't take into account the way they won was the Blitzkrieg, they called it, where they would bomb cities and they would bomb instantly with the air raids. And in cities like Stalingrad, when they bombed a city, that made it even harder for the Nazis to win, because on every street corner, in every nook and cranny of the city, there were Soviet snipers and people, average townspeople with guns and firearms. And so if they bombed the city, then it created even more holes and hiding places. And famously, the Soviets are the ones who really won World War II. That is what you have to keep in mind. The U.S. didn't even land in Europe, okay, until the Soviet Union was already victoriously marching.
That's a little too schematic, I think. If you talk to the Soviets who were actually fighting that are still alive today, they'll tell you that without the material support from the United States, the weapons support, that they wouldn't have been able to pull this off either. So.
For the world, this revolutionary, the defeat of the Nazis was such a momentum of Soviet power. That the Soviet Union was marching across Europe, and famously when the Soviets liberated a concentration camp, they let all of the people locked away walk free, and they were provided with employment and all that. However, when the Nazis, when the U.S. took a concentration camp, most of the prisoners were taken from concentration camps to prisons. If you were in prison or you were in a concentration camp for being gay or for being a communist, you were taken from a concentration camp to a prison, because both those things were illegal in the governments that the U.S. was setting up. In France, immediately after World War II, the first government that came into existence was 60% communist controlled.
Yes.
Because the communists had such a role in the resistance. And so overwhelmingly, see you next time.
Oh, no, we want to see that.
Oh, okay, all right. But yeah, so overwhelmingly the resistance to the Soviets had led, the world resistance against fascism was tremendous. In Albania, the Soviet-led resistance, Yugoslavia, the guerrilla warfare, was all led by the communist parties of these countries. In Albania, the Communist Party had been less than 20 people at the time the war broke out, and by the end of the war, it was the strongest fighting force in the country.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Enver Hoxha, the leader
yes.
of the People's Socialist Republic of Albania from 1944 to 85, his birthday was on Saturday, 16th. He would have been 102.
Cool. Yeah, and Enver Hoxha, he distinguished himself because when the capitalist anti-Nazi forces were just wanting to have an underground organization, he formed an army, and so he won up them. And so then when they formed an army, he had his army take up, start fighting, and he was always one step ahead of the capitalist forces. And people saw that the communists were the militants. Tito was a leader of guerrilla warfare in Yugoslavia, and he was.
Oh yes.
And
schooled with the Republican forces in Spain. He fought in Spain.
And in China, it was the communists who overwhelmingly did the fighting against the Japanese invaders. The nationalists on paper were against the Japanese invaders, but they didn't do anything. Their strategy was to let the communists do all the fighting and die, so they could win after the revolution. Didn't work that, or after the war. So it didn't work that way. Interestingly enough, there was a Chinese Revolution in 1949. So by the
victorious.
Yeah. So by by 1945, when the war ended, the Soviet Union was one of the strongest powers in the world at that point. Half of Europe was under their dominion, and setting up the people's democracies, they called it, where the Communist Party was in alliance with other parties building. Yugoslavia had become liberated by the revolution. Albania, sections of China, half of Korea, right? North Korea was the part that was liberated by Soviet troops. So all over the world, socialism was triumphant. And immediately after the war, the U.S. was pushing to actually attack the USSR. There was yes. even hope on President Truman's part that that they wouldn't even bring the troops home, that they would immediately go. And so there were troop strikes all around the world of troops demanding the right to come home and not be sent out to fight the USSR next. And so the USSR, and then around the world, communist parties became tremendously strong, and in addition, social democratic parties were strong. In everywhere except the United States, the post-war period was a period of many victories for the working class. In Britain, that's when the first national health care system was set up.
Yes.
In France, the communists had 60% of the parliament until they were told they wouldn't get any loans from the U.S. if communists were allowed to take seats, and so they resigned on orders from Stalin. In Italy, the Communist Party was poised to win an election, and only because the CIA rigged the election in Operation Gladio did they not win, total control of the Italian parliament. All over the world, the communists were a strong force right after World War II because they had been the most strong and victorious forces in fighting fascism. So, and after the war, Stalin was talking about, they called it the twilight of world capitalism. And that the World War II had proved that that only socialism could triumph in the face of fascism. In the U.S., the Communist Party, came out of it a very strong organization. Thousands of people had been recruited during the Popular Front, and it was a huge organization. But then in the U.S., there was economic prosperity, first of all. Because after the war, the U.S. was one of the only industrialized countries in the world not to have been totally bombed and destroyed during the war. So they had all the industry, and all around the world, all these people were wanting to buy the products from the U.S. because they were the only ones that could produce it. So, like, they had the auto industry. So the U.S. was a booming economy in the 1950s. So, generally when there's a booming economy, people tend to not want to overthrow capitalism because they think it's working out great for them.
Yeah.
Well, and there's the not inconsiderable fact that the government went into a repressive mode, persecuting, imprisoning, and killing off communist labor leaders.
Right, and that's what I was just getting to, actually, was that then there was the McCarthy era. In 1948, the entire Communist Party, anyone who was in the Communist Party was prosecuted under the Smith Act, which made it illegal to teach the violent overthrow of the U.S. government or ideologies, something or other, that basically if you're a communist, you'll go to jail. The Trotskyists had been jailed under the same law during World War II for opposing World War II, and there were massive things, and they even passed the famous McCarran Internal Security Act, which set up a network of concentration camps in the U.S., and they had a list of the FBI had the job of making a list of 2 million people that if there was a national emergency, whatever that might be, should be rounded up and put into the camps, right? That's where you hear about the FEMA camps today, right? That's what that comes from. But all these right-wingers talk about the FEMA camps were set up for communists, and they don't exist anymore largely because they were, under the, under Supreme Court rulings that law was overturned. It's not that they couldn't set it back on if they wanted to,
but the bourgeoisie then said about making communist a bad word and making capitalist, a word which everybody clutched to. It was a good thing. Capitalism was a good thing. A few times recently I have said to groups of people, small groups of people, when the chance came up, capitalism doesn't work. And the response that I've gotten is that people are afraid. They're suddenly fearful. I mean, they exhibited fear at hearing anyone say something negative about capitalism.
Yeah, I mean,
their response was fear.
Even in my hometown of Orville, Ohio, they had a speaker come from the General Electric Company, and he was there to speak about the evils of communism. And but the way he did it is he pretended to be a communist, and so he got up in front and he said, we don't need any freedom anymore. Freedom's no fun. I think the government ought to tell us all what we should say. I also think the government, but yeah, of course it is. But the people in the audience at my high school didn't seem to understand that it was sarcastic, so they ran up on the stage and beat him senseless. Yes, I'm serious.
What grade was this?
It was in 1954 in Orville, Ohio. It's an episode of the history of Orville, Ohio.
There was a similar incident in my high school. In my homeroom, there was a very large fellow, over 6'5", weighed about 300 pounds. And in my neighborhood, almost across the street from me, there was a radical Serbian language newspaper, the Zajedničar. And the FBI was staking them out, pretending to be ditch diggers in front of. So anyway, one of my classmates was explaining to a buddy of his. He says I was walking down by the sea today, and this guy is digging in a ditch. I said, yeah. So what did you do? He says he come out the ditch and he says, hey, any communists in there? And I says, what's it to you? He says, I'm FBI. His buddy says, "What'd you do?" He says, "I punched him in the face and threw him back in the ditch. Ain't no FBI works in no ditch."
There you go. Yeah, and it was, you know, it was a period of repression in the U.S.
Yeah, in such a period that I could have kissed him right there, you know.
And you know, at the same time, the U.S. had the atomic bomb, right?
Yes.
It was threatening the world during the Korean War, which is when you know, there was an attempt by the Koreans to liberate all of Korea because the U.S. had installed a military dictatorship in South Korea, Syngman Rhee.
Yes.
And so the Koreans wanted to liberate all of Korea from the U.S. domination. And at the time, then the U.S. you know, sent its troops in. And famously, when China came into the side of the Koreans again in their struggle against imperialism, Douglas MacArthur, I believe, threatened to drop 6 atomic bombs on China, famously. And he said so without the permission of President Truman. He even said, "I'm going to drop 6 atomic bombs on China." And Truman famously fired him, and that was a scandal. But that was, the U.S. was running around the world with the atomic bomb, saying, "We've got the atomic bomb, no one else has it."